everybody. We're running slightly late after lunch, but I'm sure that's just because we're having so many good discussions at lunchtime that it was hard to come back into the main room. So I want to introduce you to our panel for this session. I'm actually going to introduce you to Hans Sommer, who's going to chair the panel, and then he'll introduce you to the individual speakers. We're very lucky to have Hans with us today. He's the director of DOCUS, which is the Irish National Platform of Development NGOs. And he also chairs the Act Now on 2015 campaign in support of Ireland's commitment to help achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and has been very actively campaigning for the Sustainable Development Goals to achieve disability inclusion. So I'll hand over to Hans to introduce our panellists.
So, good afternoon, everybody. This is the graveyard shift, I guess. Oh, sorry, thank you. You've all had a lovely lunch, so you're looking forward to a nice snooze. So I thought my job is to keep you awake. But before I do that, I'll just ask everybody, the speakers, as well as yourselves, when you're asking questions, make sure to speak slowly. For some of us, English is only our 6th or 7th language. So, bear with us, okay? So, before I introduce the speakers for this session, it's just to say we stay with the topic of international development cooperation and disability inclusion for this session. So I thought I'd just ask you a question first. Most of you will have heard the Irish Minister for Development Cooperation yesterday. So my question to you is, after listening to him, do you now know exactly what Irish Aid does when it comes to disability inclusion? Those who say yay, raise your hands. Okay, we'll have to go back to that. We'll ask him to come back tomorrow. Earlier on, we also talked about the importance of data in decision making. So I also thought for this panel, we should have a bit of evidence base. So here comes my baseline question, and I'll ask it again at the end of the session. Do you think bilateral aid donors are constructively and positively engaging with disability inclusion as an issue? Those in favour? Wow, this is a tough audience. Okay, so that's the baseline, 3. And at the end of the session, hopefully, our speakers will have radically increased that score. So we have a very good panel. Just before we came on air, I asked them, so who are really the leaders when it comes to development cooperation when it comes to disability? And they said, oh, we are, of course. No, I'm misrepresenting facts horribly. But anyway, the first speaker, I think, has definitely some right to claim expertise in this area. He's been working on inclusion for most of his professional life. Fiach O'Brien Malloy, his CV is in your pack there. But he works I have to read this because this is a long title, Disability Policy and Technical Specialist within the Inclusive Society section of the UK's DFID. DFID is the Department for International Development. So he works on the program of in disability inclusion, but he also just told me about the Youth for Change program that he's working on, which is essentially working with young people and getting them to campaign on issues of global justice. So, Fiach, the floor is yours, and we've been told to keep an eye on the clock. So I'll be shouting when you go over time.
Jadif, I was going to try and beat Maria's amazing record of 240 words a minute. I might have to at this rate. Okay, so my name is Fiach O'Brien Malloy. I work in the Department for International Development. This is going to be a fairly abridged version in order to keep on time, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we're all about. What that means in context, tell you about our framework document. The takeaway point is that it's not a strategy, it's just a very practical document. And I want to tell you a little bit about our strategic commitment on data because it's something that people have been talking about a lot today already. And to a bit of a reference back to Maria's piece, I'll tell you specifically how we understand our obligations in this territory against Article 11. And then I think we can't be having this conversation this year without talking about the wider kind of development architecture that's going to kind of guide our way for the next 15 years. So I'll briefly talk about that. And then a random thought about what I've been thinking about lately, and an interesting opportunity that's on my mind. And then you'll all feel very happy, and then you'll think that DFID is a great organisation at the end. So just a bit of expectation setting. So we're a UK government department. I think it's useful to mention that because it's not the only delivery modality for overseas development assistance. We're an independent government department, and our current administration have made a strong commitment to maintaining that. But I'm not here to represent the whole of the UK government. I'm here just to speak on behalf of DFID today. We've got 29 priority countries at the moment. Occasionally we find ourselves in other places, normally driven by conflict or other types of disaster. But in terms of our priority countries, predominantly in Africa, with some in the Caribbean and also some in Asia, none of which will be a huge surprise. To you, we've got a range of priority themes. Humanitarian response is one of our priority themes, so you've been thinking a little bit about Article 11 already today. Girls and women and economic development, also our priority themes in DFID. But a really, really fascinating time to be in DFID, because we're the first of the G7 countries to actually enshrine in law a 0.7% of gross national income spend on international development assistance. And it's kind of a lonely table to be at. We're not the biggest spender, but in terms of percentage, we're the first country to hit that target, and we look forward to other countries joining us at that table soon. And also, last year we had a phenomenal piece of legislation passed, which said that essentially for every pound that we spend on development assistance, we need to consider its impact on women and girls. So a really amazing time to be in DFID, a really strong mandate as our economy grows, so too will our budget, which I think is phenomenal. But also, there's a kind of less thought about piece of legislation in the United Kingdom that, while it isn't wheeled out very much, it has a profound impact on the way that I think, and I think on the way that the government department as a whole thinks, which is Section 145 of the Equality Act 2010, which places positive obligations on government departments in the United Kingdom to consider their impact on equality. We're a funny organisation, so we don't actually do anything. We just think a lot and spend a lot of money. And actually, technical assistance is one of the things that we're recognised when we go to our partner countries, and hopefully by other donors, is the strength of our technical assistance. And one of the big conversations that we're having in DFID at the moment that we're just kicking off is this conversation about, do we make or do we buy? So at the moment we buy, and we're going to have a conversation about whether we should make as well. I'm not saying we're going to go down the German route and have an implementing agency, but it's certainly a conversation which is alive and well in DFID today. So that's the context. So a little bit of a story then about last year. Last year was really, really busy, and there was a huge amount of lobbying that went on. Some of the people responsible for that lobbying are here in the room. And we were satisfying this parliamentary beast last year. It was all about parliamentary processes. There was a select committee, an IDC, International Development Committee, hearing into how DFID does in terms of disability. And if it was a kind of a school report card, it would have said, could do better. So there was some pockets of great practice across DFID, but nothing systemic. And so our reaction to this was on the UN Day for Persons with Disabilities on the 3rd of December last year. We published this framework document. It's built from the bottom up on the social model of disability, although some pragmatic approach to the social model. And it gives rise to this great role of disability champion, Maria, in DFID. So Beverly Warmington is our disability champion, and she really is that. So she's a director level person who essentially makes a lot of noise about disability wherever she goes, and there is a flurry of activity in her wake. And we also have brought together a group of experts from within DFID who are allowed to spend 10% of their time on delivering disability capacity in their area of specialism, be it economics, climate change, or health. And we made this document not on our own. So we made this document through really deep engagement with our partners in the UK, and I think that they should feel a sense of shared ownership over it, but also through engagement with DPOs in the Global South. So myself, I was fortunate enough to be able to go and engage directly with DPOs in Mozambique last year in the lead up to the publication of this document to really ensure that it had authenticity and that it reflected voice throughout. And Annex A to that document, which I'd commend to you, is just a list of all of our sectors, what we're going to do there. And the document really, it was published very publicly, but it's for DFID staff. It's really about saying, it deliberately not calling it a strategy. It's meant to be a very practical document about just getting DFID staff to do stuff and to do more. So in terms of making it real in DFID, it's been really important to us to have ministerial leadership, and that's been continuous through the change of administration. Baroness Verma there, I've not screen grabbed her at a very kind of flattering moment, but she is our Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State. She sits in the Lords, and she's really passionate about disability inclusion, but we saw that in Minister Featherstone and also Baroness Northover previously. And my role at the moment has really been about getting up really early in the morning, trying to work across time zones and engaging directly with country offices to make this real in their country office context. But I guess a lot of what I said before about we don't actually do anything, we just buy stuff, has really been that we've been hugely trying to influence partners to do more in this space. And we can't do anything without those partnerships working. We're mandating it in some areas, and in some areas we're using more of a carrot than a stick. I've just got a half-time notice. Okay, I think a really important thing for us over the last 18 months has been getting our own house in order. So in order to have some degree of legitimacy in this space, we can't turn around and say that we've got a terrible employment record for people with disabilities, for example. So we've been working really, really hard on areas like mental health and disability inclusion in employment more widely to make sure that we have a compelling narrative on both sides of the fence. And we've also been intensely trying to communicate what we're doing and to influence not just NGOs, INGOs, etc., to step up and to occupy some of this space with us, but also through our conversations with colleagues in other governments and with other multilateral actors, we've been trying to do the same. I think I can't go without mentioning our strategic commitment on data. So we brought people together in London for a big party last October on statistics, a very exciting subject. And one of the outcomes of that was our commitment to use the Washington Group short set of questions on disability. They're an imperfect set of questions. It's probably conspicuous by its absence, but they don't measure mental health. But they lend themselves really well to being embedded in programs, censuses, surveys, and we've had some real success in working with partner governments in Yemen and Burma, for example, where we've been able to embed a version of these questions into their national censuses. And with the ECOSOC resolution on data disaggregation, hopefully in the 2020 round of censuses, we should see a similar kind of adoption of these questions, and that will give us data that we can compare from country to country, which is going to be critical, specifically in the context of a universal set of goals. Now, in order to save time, we're going to skip past this, but on Article 11, we're mandating data disaggregation from partners, developing guidance specifically on mental health and psychological support in disaster context, as well as a full programme cycle approach to disability inclusion in humanitarian responses more widely, where people with disabilities are seen as actors who have voice at all stages of the humanitarian response. In terms of the post-2015 architecture then, acutely mindful of my time, sorry, they're not the only show in town. The SDGs are getting so much press, but they're not the only thing that's happening right now. And also the deal is most definitely not done. So we're having conversations about how we're actually going to measure whether we get there or not. And the indicators which sit alongside the Sustainable Development Goals, which are really good in terms of disability inclusion in my perspective, need to also have disability hardwired into them. And actually, you know, the early indications were that we might have kind of slipped up on that with the first meeting to determine the indicators. But hopefully we can get back on track before March of next year. Our approach is underpinned by this idea of leaving no one behind and being able to demonstrate that no one is being left behind in the world that we want to see in 2030 through the disaggregation of data, and that means disaggregation on the basis of disability too. And we don't think that any of the goals should be considered to be met unless they're met for absolutely everybody. And one of the amazing things about the post-2015 architecture is that it's totally universal. It applies to the UK as much as it applies to Malawi. So I think a real strength coming from that universality. Financing for development, less of an exciting topic for some, but absolutely critical. And just last week we saw disability evaporate from paragraph 12 of the agreement there, but actually through strong pressure from the European Union, we saw disability reintegrated into the section on social protection, which I think is really, really important. And in the lead up to the Paris Conference of State Parties on the Climate Convention, I think it's equally important that we're factoring disability and building on some of the conversation that we were having earlier today about Sendai. And another amazing international moment is going to be Istanbul next May when we have the World Humanitarian Summit. Now, Ida and colleagues are ensuring that disabled people will have voice through that process, but I think it could be even further ramped up to make it less of just an online survey and more of a process of active engagement. Okay, so penultimate slide. So Hashim is in the room. One of the thoughts that I've been having recently is about Section D of Article 32, it speaks to technology and technology transfer. And I think it's an underexploited area with potentially huge benefits about how do we take some of that technological gain that we've made in the UK and in other countries and accelerate the change that we want to see in partner countries in less developed contexts. And so Hashim and I have been having an initial conversation about how DFID can help in that space in terms of designing a series of questions that will be able to be used to assess assistive technologies to determine the extent to which they actually really meaningfully leverage inclusion. And that's me.
Thanks very much, Steve, and well within the time limit. So, very good example, I think, of how a government, a donor, is looking at disability and inclusion all the way from policy, from political commitment, down to policy, down to instruments, down to data. The only thing that I couldn't take up was workplace commitment for inside your own house, so maybe that's a question for the debate. So next we go to Australia. So we've two. Sorry. Yeah. No, we'll go to this one. Yeah. So we'll go to get an example from Australia. Sorry about that. Darcy Lyons has been involved in the development of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. It's disability strategy. She works in the disability section there and has almost 10 years of experience in the issue. And the other speaker is Felicity O'Brien, who works in the same department and has specific responsibility for a Pacific region. So we're going to get a case study now from Australia. Darcy. Oh, actually,
Sorry?
Yeah, that's right. Let's see, where is this good?
Great, thank you very much. Hello, as mentioned, my name's Darcy Lyons. I'm delighted to be here at the conference both as a participant and a presenter, so thank you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to do so. In our brief presentation today, Felicity and I will provide an overview of Australia's strategic approach to disability inclusive development, and I'll do that through providing an overview of key aspects of our disability inclusive development strategy. I'll then hand over to Felicity, who will give an example of the Pacific Disability Forum, which has already been mentioned in the conference, and it's something that Australia supports, and it's one way that we're implementing our strategy. For those with a vision impairment, the picture on the slide there is of a woman who is a wheelchair user. She's using an accessible pump, which was something that Australia supported. As you may be aware, disability inclusive development became a priority for the Australian Aid Program in 2009, just after Australia ratified the Crpd in 2008. This first strategy, titled Development for All Towards a Disability Inclusive Australian Aid Program, guided Australia's disability inclusive efforts from 2009 to 2014. This strategy highlighted the importance of recognising and supporting the inherent dignity and human rights of people with disabilities in accordance with the CRPD. The slide there has got a picture of the previous strategy cover, which has a picture of a girl in a wheelchair. We've just recently launched our current strategy, the second strategy for the Australian Aid Program in May of this year. It's titled Development for All, Strategy for Strengthening Disability Inclusive Development in Australia's Aid Program, and it outlines how we plan on implementing disability inclusive development over the next 5 years. In accordance with the CRPD and the Nothing About Us Without Us principle, the strategy was informed, and that's our new strategy, I should have clicked to that, sorry. The strategy was informed by consultations with people with disabilities and their representative organisations, as well as with disability advocates and representatives from NGOs and multilateral organisations. These consultations were conducted in Australia and the Indo-Pacific region, where our aid program is focused. Our strategy is underpinned by the CRPD, including principles which we've spoken about within the course of the summer school, including non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, accessibility and equality of opportunity. The cover there of the Development for All, our current strategy, has got 3 photos on it. The first one is a meeting of members of a DPO called the Psychiatric Survivors Fiji. The second one is of Indigenous people with disabilities meeting in the Chittagong tracks in Bangladesh. And the third one is people with disabilities who live and work on the street in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and they're meeting to organise. Moving on to the next slide, the ultimate aim of the strategy is to contribute to real and positive change in the daily experiences of people with disabilities. The objectives of the strategy are to promote improved quality of life of people with disabilities in developing countries. And we'll seek to do that through supporting enhanced empowerment, leadership and decision-making amongst people with disabilities in community, government and the private sector, working to reduce poverty for people with disabilities, and improving equality in all areas of life for people with disabilities, including in service provision, education and employment. This next slide outlines Australia's approach to disability inclusive development. It includes the twin track approach. So Australia supports mainstreaming disability inclusion as a cross-cutting issue in the aid program, as well as supporting disability-specific activities. This approach recognises the targeted efforts are required to address barriers experienced by people with disabilities, which undermine their full and effective participation. In line with this principle, Australia supports strategic partnerships with organisations such as the Disability Rights Fund, the Pacific Disability Forum and the Australian Disability Alliance, which work to increase the capacity of DPOs to engage and lead on both disability inclusive development but disability rights advocacy more broadly. The picture on this slide provides an example of this approach. It illustrates DPO representatives discussing disability rights awareness raising strategies with the Australian Ambassador Peter Doyle in 2014 in Timor-Leste. Australia also recognises that disability inclusion must be embedded in general aid programming to enable people with disabilities to participate in and benefit from our aid programs more broadly. The previous strategy focused on disability inclusion in education and infrastructure, so there's some good practice to build on. For example, the Australian Aid Program supported the Access to Quality Education program in Fiji, and we've done so since 2011. This program is increasing educational opportunities for children with disabilities in mainstream demonstration schools that, importantly, are close to their homes. To provide for children with disabilities in these demonstration schools, teachers receive training and mentoring, teachers' aides have been employed and trained in sign language and braille, and schools receive an inclusive education small grant to cover the costs of meeting the individual needs of students with disabilities. A key focus of implementing our new strategy will be working with our colleagues across DFAT to change the way they work, to help them mainstream disability inclusion more broadly within their general aid programming. As noted in the slide, Australia's approach to disability inclusive development recognises the value of strategic partnerships in leveraging broader change. To enhance disability inclusive development, we'll work with our partners, including partner governments, multilateral organisations, civil societies, importantly including DPOs, and increasingly with the private sector. For example, we support the United Nations Partnership to Promote the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or UNPRPD, which Catalina mentioned yesterday. UNPRPD brings together UN entities, governments, DPOs and broader civil society to build coalitions and develop capacity to implement the CRPD at a national, regional and global level. As well as investing in aid, Australia also uses diplomatic efforts and advocacy in regional and international forums. For example, recently Australia was involved in the CRPD Community of State Parties, COSP, promoting disability inclusion, and is also a founding member of the APEC Group of Friends on Disability. In this next slide, the guiding principles for the strategy are outlined. These principles, the first one is nothing about us without us. The strategy supports an active and central role for people with disabilities. And Australia will continue to support DPOs in developing countries to engage and lead on disability inclusive development and disability rights. This recognises that DPOs play a vital role in representing people with disabilities and contribute to more effective development processes and outcomes. Practices and outcomes. As mentioned, Australia, in line with what Fiac was saying in regard to data and evidence, that's also a new, data specifically, is a new area of focus for the Australian Aid Program. So the second principle is outlines Australia's commitment to developing policies and programs based on evidence. In relation to data, Australia recognises that that decision makers can all too easily overlook the inclusion of people with disabilities without robust data. Robust data, it also makes it impossible to benchmark and monitor progress on disability inclusion globally. As well as establishing prevalence rates at the national level, disaggregated data from the national to the program level is a powerful tool for comparing outcomes between groups at risk of being left behind. Without data that can be broken down by disability status and gender, we risk not knowing whether we're inadvertently entrenching disadvantage and leaving people with disabilities behind. As a critical first step, like DFAT supports the UN recommendation that the Washington Group short set of questions be inserted in all monitoring data systems. A couple of weeks ago, Australia entered into a new partnership agreement with both the Washington Group and the UN Statistical Division to help fill this gap. The photo on this particular PowerPoint is of a community worker conducting an interview with a family to collect data on disability status for the Cambodian Health Survey in 2014, which included the Washington Group short set of questions. Australia also recognises that women and girls with disabilities in developing countries can experience compounded discrimination and disadvantage, as we've heard yesterday as well, as a result of being female, having a disability and living in poverty. This limits the agency of women and girls with disabilities and constrains their opportunities for economic, political and social participation and advancement. Therefore, taking into account the interaction between gender and disabilities is an important principle of the strategy. The last guiding principle there recognises that disability is part of human diversity and that all communities have people with varying types of disabilities with varying impacts. As we've heard, some groups within the disability community are at heightened risk of marginalisation, particularly those with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities. We'll therefore continue to support DPOs, including through our partnerships I've mentioned, with the International Disability Alliance, the Disability Rights Fund and the Pacific Disability Forum, to support the promotion of the rights of people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, including through building their capacity to self-advocate. We'll also seek to explore other opportunities to support the rights of people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities. This will include seeking to work with our partner governments to promote relevant and enforceable anti-discrimination legislation. The final slide outlines the key sectors within We Will Work. These are the key sectors that we will focus our mainstreaming efforts. They are governance for equality, accessible infrastructure, including water, sanitation and hygiene, inclusive education and skills, as well as inclusive humanitarian protection, disaster risk reduction and social protection. For example, in line with this, Australia will be supporting the involvement of people with disabilities in the processes and outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit to ensure that the outcomes are disability inclusive. In the interests of time, I'll hand over now to Felicity, who will provide an overview of the Pacific Disability Forum, which relates specifically to our sector focus on governance and also to the Nothing About Us Without Us principle.
Hi. So first of all, I'm going to cover the Pacific context and then talk about the Pacific Disability Forum, a regional organisation that DFAT support. And then I'll move on to a regional strategy that is in place to support the work that we do on disability in the region. So DFAT supports 14 countries in the Pacific. These countries must be members of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. I don't know if you've heard of them. So just to kind of situate ourselves in the Pacific, the population of the Pacific is, this is not including New Zealand and Australia, is around 8 million. So the most populous nation there is Papua New Guinea with about 7.3 million people. And then we have some really small island states such as Tuvalu and Nauru have populations of around 10,000. The Solomon Islands has 922 islands and 347 of those islands are inhabited. So I think you kind of get the image that the Pacific context is such that there's not much opportunity for economic growth. Oh, sorry, I forgot to flick the slide over. And it's a very resource-limited environment, and it's very difficult and very expensive to provide services in the region. Having accessible services in place that can reach or be reached by those populations is a huge challenge, and you can imagine how much more difficult it is to provide services to people with a disability. So with regard to disability in the Pacific, as we've been talking about during the conference, there's a real need to improve the data and the research on the prevalence of disability in the Pacific and the unique challenges that people in the Pacific face. So with the best available data, we think that about 1.2 million people across the Pacific, again not including Australia and New Zealand, have a disability. So here's a map of Australia and the Pacific. So all those islands over to the right there where we provide support. So it's a pretty big distance, as you can see. And yeah, the islands are spread over vast distances. And the next slide is just a table of the ratification status of the CRPD for the Pacific. So around half the countries that we provide support to have now ratified the CRPD. So why work regionally? There's low levels of development across the Pacific, and that means there's a lack of funding for disability activities. There's also common challenges and a lack of available resources at the national level, and so that sort of warrants a regional approach to disability and other social issues across the Pacific, such as gender equality. The Pacific Island countries are all at varying stages of development with regard to addressing disability. So some countries now have clear rights-based policies in place, but few still yet have specific legislation in place. As we discussed before, or I discussed before, geography and demography are really big challenges for us working in this area. So we've got relatively small populations dispersed widely over really difficult terrain and scattered over many island atolls. There's also some pretty good established regional approaches for other issues in the Pacific, and it's an appropriate way to address issues that are culturally and or politically sensitive in the Pacific. Working regionally can promote cost efficiencies and information sharing. We also have a couple of very high-level and very well-respected regional organisations, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community and the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and I'll call them PIFs and SPC. So PIFs support the disability work in the region. We've got some pretty good commitment from the leaders in the region on disability issues, which is great, and we're starting to see that a lot of international NGOs and even UN agencies are starting to sort of work a bit more regionally now too because of the challenges. So I'll move on to the Pacific Disability Forum. So the Australian government has been providing core support to the Pacific Disability Forum since 2011. And the purpose of the Pacific Disability Forum is to promote and facilitate regional cooperation on disability. I'll call them PDF. PDF's work relates, as Darcy pointed out, to the governance section of our disability strategy. So they work to get CRP ratification across the Pacific, implement policy and law reform, and advocate for disability issues. PDF take a human rights-based approach to the issue of disability inclusion and assist national governments to develop and implement policies and action plans to implement the CRPD. They're a regional peak body and a sort of an umbrella organisation for DPOs in the region, and they work in partnership with the DPOs to build their capacity and improve their advocacy efforts. So they assist with awareness-raising activities of disability rights and provide advice to governments on policies, both national and regional. And they work closely with the regional organisation I mentioned before, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. The strengths of the PDF as a regional model are that it's a culturally relevant and sensitive way to work in the Pacific. It's highly representative of the countries it serves across the region. So they have a board in place with representatives from each of the countries around the region. And it's a really strong and unified voice of people with disability. PDF are very well regarded. They have really good governance and diverse representation. They've got strong management and good engagement across the region at all levels and also internationally. They're seen as the best practice model as they successfully work at the local, the regional, the national and the international levels. Another strength of the PDF is that they're good at moving with the times. So it was recommended quite a few years back that they strengthen their engagement with youth and strengthen their engagement on gender equality, and they've done a really good job at doing that. So they make sure that they engage with youth across the region and provide support for their advocacy work too. And with gender equality work, they've got a very representative board with women on it, and they also have a separate women's committee. So now I move on to regionalism and the Pacific Regional Strategy on Disability. So in 2009, the Pacific Regional Strategy on Disability was developed by the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and it underpins all the disability efforts in the region. It's sort of really known as the Pacific's interpretation of the CRPD, and it's also an implementation plan for the CRPD. So it emphasises the need for political leadership in addressing disability issues at national levels and affirms the central role of people with disability. So I'll just race through so that we've got time for questions at the end. So the future for PDF. So there's questions around sustainability. The PDF have an enormous workload, as you can imagine. They travel across the Pacific to run training programs for newly established DPOs, and this requires intensive support. So they cover off on training to get a DPO up and running. So they provide financial administration training, project proposal writing, and on how to lobby and do good advocacy work. So the PDF has grown very quickly and it continues to grow. So currently there are 60 member organisations across the Pacific compared with 13 members in 2006. So there's also a push for the PDF to move into other policy spaces such as sexual and reproductive health rights and non-communicable disease prevention. So they can't really do everything, and I think there's sort of an expectation that as a regional organisation they should do everything to do with disability. So we're about to undertake a review of the PDF and our partnership with them. So we're hoping that the review will provide DFAT and PDF with some guidance on how we can position ourselves for the future partnership and the future of this work. So we're going to seek some recommendations on how to address the questions I just sort of went over and the challenges that PDF have. And hopefully that will provide some lessons learned for other geographic areas on how working regionally or with a model like this could be beneficial. So watch this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Felicity. So that's the example from Australia. I noticed there was no mention of the drastic cuts to the Australian aid budget, but so maybe that's actually an illustration that it's not all about money, it's actually about political will, so thank you for that. Also, I did wonder, a couple of years ago we were in a similar forum and we were all very excited because the Australian government was going to appoint an ambassador on disability. I think that role has fallen by the wayside, has it? Okay. Look, you were all very sceptical before this session about aid donors and disability inclusion. So let's have some questions. I propose that we go into our time for tea a bit for the discussions because that's the interesting part. So can we have a microphone for the lady? Oh, can we have one for the panel? I'll take a couple of questions and then we can come back to the panel. Yeah? So I have a hand there and two purple hands there.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to our presenter for that very interesting presentation. My name is Chifu Chombo. I'm coming from the University of Namibia Center for Human Rights. I've got two questions. One is, I just wanted to find out from the presenter, how do you identify your countries to work with? Is there any criteria which you normally use? And secondly, to our last presenter, I want to find out what are the activities which you normally engage the youth? Because I found that's a very, very interesting program. How do you engage the youth? Thank you.
Okay. You, yeah.
Hello? Okay, so hi, I'm Jana from Germany. Thank you for your presentations. I'm a disability researcher, so I'm very unfamiliar with the whole process of policy development, or like in international development. So I was curious, so maybe it's just me wondering, because I'm having a hard time to imagine the practical work of convincing your regional partners. So I have two questions and a concern on maybe to all speakers, and to what extent were people with disabilities, or are people with disabilities themselves involved in your agency or in your organisation? And how do you make sure that they are fairly represented or actively participating? And I was asking the question about the institutionalization and this morning, so that some programs which might be disability specific are not really in line with the UN CRPD and the human rights based model on disability. So how do you ensure when your partners are proposed for or ask for funding for disability specific programs that these are in line with the CRPD? Thank you.
Very good. Do we have any more questions? Behind you there. Any more? Okay, and here. We have the other microphone here already.
Hi, I'm Kimberly O'Hara from the Open Society Foundations. I wanted to also ask about youth and just say that where I work, part of my portfolio is to focus on developing more attention to the specific issues that youth with disabilities in various contexts face. So I'd love to also hear what you are doing, and anything on that.
I wanted to ask a question in relation to the last two speakers, and in particular I wanted to inquire what is the relationship between yourselves and New Zealand in relation to disability issues, and is there any difficulty in the bilateral relationship between yourselves and New Zealand, who are the two of the more developed countries in the region? How does that work out? I should say to you that I used to work for the Department of Foreign Affairs here, so I have some knowledge of inter-country friction. Well, friction is the wrong word, but you get the drift.
Okay, that's a whole series of questions. Maybe if you can give us really short answers so we have time for another round of questions. And I'd like to just abuse my position here of power and also ask, in how far do we know that the policies and the practices that both your countries have started now are actually making a difference on the ground for people living with disabilities? So, question about priority countries, about youth, about involvement of people with disabilities in your organizations. How do you work with rights in your partner organizations? And how do you link with New Zealand? Do you want to start, Vic?
Yeah, is it switched on?
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm probably not going to deal with these all in the right order. Is the green lights on?
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Right. Good stuff. How do we identify our priority countries? So I said that we're in 29. I mean, in reality, we're in about 40. But 29 places where we actually have a DFID office. And where there's a huge amount of bilateral spend. But actually, if you look at where we spent a vast amount of money last year, I think circa 250 million quid. In Syria, we don't actually have an office there. They're identified strategically through looking at poverty for the most part. I mean, if you condensed everything did down into one sentence, we're all about ending poverty, extreme poverty by 2030. And so that drives our country selection. There's also a kind of where do we have relationships part of that. And for example, it doesn't feel like it would make a huge amount of sense for us to be operating in the Pacific Islands. But when something goes particularly wrong, we'll be there in terms of delivering a humanitarian response. The process is complex and very methodological, and it is frequently revisited. And with the change in government, we go through a process of reviewing and then operational planning. So we've got a number of reviews that have kicked off inside DFID when we got our new administration. that are going to kind of essentially inform, do we have the relationships with the right people in the right places? And so we're going through that process again at the moment. I'm guessing you're probably asking because we're not in Namibia. But yeah. Okay, so there was a question about youth, I think, which I could talk forever and a day about. It was meant to only be 5% of my time, but I've got this really cool program called Youth for Change, which was ahead of a summit that we held last year in London, where what happened is we decided that young people should be part of setting the agenda for this Girls' Summit. It was all about girls' rights, with a heavy focus on female genital mutilation and child early and forced marriage. And my program Youth for Change is terrifying and exciting in equal measure because it's run by a group of young people, and as a professional bureaucrat, that sometimes gives me cause to stay awake at night. And they're rolling out their campaign to stop FGM and CEFM within their generation. And there's something hugely powerful about that, the fact that they can actually be the generation to end those practices, and it's phenomenal. And understanding that it's their bodies and their lives, and they should have a say in what happens to their bodies and their lives. And actually, this whole point about youth voice and youth participation, I think, is a space that the FIU is going to move into rapidly. So our new Secretary of State, she's not new, but she's come back with this unbridled ambition on youth, and that will have its tentacles in absolutely everything that we do. So it won't be over here as a programme or a policy specialism. It will be like our approach to women and girls, in that it will be systemic and that we will be globally recognised for our work on youth. And I think anything less in the Secretary of State will not be content. There was also a question about voice of people with disabilities. So I talked a little bit about some of the engagement we did with DPOs in the Global South and in the UK. Is our level of engagement right at the moment? I don't think that we've necessarily calibrated our relationship specifically in the UK with DPOs necessarily as effectively as we could have. But do people with disabilities have voice in both our framework document? Yes. And it's predicated on that principle that people with disabilities should be active participants in the decisions that affect their lives. And that principle is one that we try to stay true to. Have I covered most of the areas?
I think so, unless you want to talk about New Zealand.
So I'll cover the issues from the Pacific perspective. And could you actually
take it off the stand.
So in the Pacific, the way we identify the countries that we provide support to is they have to be a member of that organisation I spoke about called the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. So only member states of that organisation will receive development assistance from Australia. So there's 14 in total at the moment. I think there's 16 in total members, including Australia and New Zealand. So I might move on to that question now. So in the Pacific development space, we work pretty well with New Zealand. I've done a bit of work with them on gender mostly. I haven't had much to do with them with disability. I don't think they have much of a focus on disability in the region. They did used to support that organisation I spoke about, Pacific Disability Forum, but they pulled back on a lot of their aid to the Pacific. But we do a lot of work with them on gender equality work. And recently we had an innovation challenge at DFAT, and one of the things that won at that competition was a cloud passport, which is, I don't really understand how it works, but it's a passport for Australian and New Zealand passport holders so that we can cross countries without having to have a passport or a visa. I don't think you need a visa anyway, but yeah, I think that sort of shows that there's a pretty good relationship there. And I think on the trade side, it's pretty good too. So on the youth question, again, from a specific perspective, most of the work we do is on leadership of youth and building their capacity and leadership skills. In a gender space, that's what we also concentrate on. And we do have a couple of little programs in place that are targeted at young women leaders in the region to train them up and do mock courts and things like that so that they can run for Parliament. And they start that from quite a young age, which is pretty exciting work. That's only sort of been happening over the last year and a half, so it's a pretty new program. And with people with disability in our organisation, we have a network of staff with a disability. I'm actually a co-chair of that network, and we meet with senior management on a 6-weekly basis where we can filter any concerns that staff have up the ranks to management. I think DFAT's getting a little bit better at dealing internally with staff that have a disability, and there's a real push to concentrate on that at the moment. A couple of weeks ago, we had one of our ministers who has mental health issues come and give an all-staff address about his battle with severe depression, and it was so powerful. I have heard people talking about it ever since, and you know, they're starting to do things like that to kind of create a bit more awareness of disability within the department. And there's a push also to try and get staff members to disclose that they have a disability so that they can be provided with support. We won't get into the controversies of that.
Maybe, Darcy, do you want to have a final say? Because I know we're standing between people and coffee, so it's a dangerous area.
Certainly. Perhaps then I'll pick up on how do we know that we're making a difference, because I think the other ones have been covered off, and a very challenging but important question. And I think that this is an area that DFAT is going to really try and focus on over the next 5 years. Using the Washington Group short set of questions will enable us to disaggregate our monitoring and evaluation data by disability. So it'll enable us to look at what are the outcomes or what are the desired outcomes of a particular program, and are they being effective for people with disabilities, are people with disabilities beneficiaries of that program. And one way that we're going to try and do that is we've got a network of NGO partners, and we're looking to trial a pilot program with them, working with them to embed the Washington Group questions in their data monitoring and evaluation. And then we're looking to develop some guidance out of that so that we can encourage others and support others to use the Washington Group questions as well. We also have what's called aid quality checks for our aid investments, and they're mandatory for aid investments over $3 million and encouraged for aid investments beneath that. And in that process, program managers are required to report on the extent to which they have proactively identified barriers for people with disabilities and overcome them. So they have to rate themselves. And the other thing that they have to rate themselves on within that is to what extent have they engaged with DPOs, disabled people's organisations, in all phases of the aid programming cycle, which Rosemary outlined the aid programming cycle yesterday.
Okay, I think we are well over time, so we'll have to call. Yeah, I know I promised you a second round of questions, but sorry, I have to break my own promise. I do think we should give the speakers some feedback again. So earlier on, I asked you to vote about whether bilateral donors engage constructively and positively with disabilities. So can we have another vote on that same question? Do you think aid donors engage constructively with disability after hearing these contributions? Who says yes? Come on, okay, put your hand up, I can't see them. Okay, I think it's a bit more than 3 anyway, so I think there is a positive feedback for you. So listen, everybody, thank you very much for speaking. Misty and Darcy.